The humid air inside the master bedroom of Rev Plantation hung heavy, thick with the mingled scents of liniment, decay, and the faint sweetness of rotting flowers. The velvet curtains had been drawn tight against the pitiless Louisiana sun, trapping the heat within and casting the room in a perpetual twilight. Dust motes floated in the single beam of light that forced its way through a small gap, illuminating the slow surrender of grandeur to neglect. Once this had been a room of power and wealth, filled with the quiet hum of servants and the chatter of guests. Now it was a tomb not just for the man lying in the grand four-poster bed, but for everything his world represented. Auguste Deveau, master of Rev, had once been a towering figure of wealth and intellect, the very image of Southern aristocracy. Now he was a ruin of a man, his skin stretched thin and waxy over a skeletal frame, his breath rattling like dry leaves. The disease consuming him had left only a shell, but behind his sunken eyes burned a terrible, feverish brilliance. His mind, corrupted by obsession, remained sharp, and within it festered an idea that had long since crossed the line between genius and madness. He was a king presiding over a kingdom of dust, and his mind, dark, brilliant, decaying, was the last territory he still ruled. Standing at the window, his wife Isabelle was the picture of composure and restraint. Her silk gown clung to a body made brittle by years of silent endurance, and her pale face betrayed nothing of the exhaustion that lived beneath her calm. Once admired for her beauty and grace, she had become something colder, a woman trapped between the monstrous will of her dying husband and the desperate social standing she was forced to preserve. Outside, the sugarcane fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon, their green waves shimmering under the sun, a vision of wealth built upon unspoken human misery. She stared at that horizon as if praying for deliverance, but deliverance never came to Rev. In the corner of the room, Amara moved silently. Barely 20, her movements were measured, graceful, and deliberate, her expression unreadable as she changed the damp sheets beneath her master. There was dignity in the way she carried herself, a quiet defiance that neither sickness nor cruelty could erode. Auguste's hollow eyes followed her with an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate. In his gaze, she was no longer a person. She was a specimen, an instrument for the legacy that consumed his final days. "It is not blasphemy, Isabelle," he rasped, his voice dry and commanding even in weakness. "It is science, a simple truth. We breed horses for strength and speed. We cultivate cane for its sweetness. Why not our people for their endurance and obedience?" He gestured weakly toward a leather-bound book beside his bed, its cracked spine a testament to years of obsession. His trembling hands gripped the sheets, as though he could anchor his monstrous ideas to the mortal world for a few more breaths. "This is not cruelty," he wheezed, his feverish eyes burning brighter. "It is legacy, a perfect, self-sustaining engine of prosperity." Isabelle turned, her face pale, her composure faltering for the first time. "The Lord decides the nature of his children, Auguste," she said softly, her voice trembling with a fear she tried to disguise as piety. "We must not meddle in his designs." A dry, brittle laugh escaped him, the sound of faith stripped bare. "The Lord helps those who help themselves, my dear. He gave man dominion over the beasts, and what are they if not that? Assets, instruments. To refuse to improve them would be to reject his gift." He looked again at Amara, studying her the way a scholar examines an artifact. Her strength, her poise, to him, these were not signs of humanity, but desirable traits. His gaze lingered too long, too hungrily. Amara felt the weight of it and stiffened, her skin crawling. She did not speak, but in the quiet set of her shoulders and the stillness of her hands, there was rebellion, the only rebellion she could safely afford. Isabelle turned back to the window, but her reflection in the glass betrayed her horror. Her husband's words had stopped sounding like theories. They had become something real, something that breathed and demanded action. The plantation had always been a world built on cruelty, But August's vision sought to turn cruelty into a legacy, to codify suffering into science. Days passed in suffocating silence. The servants moved through the halls like ghosts, their whispers carrying rumors of strange orders and midnight experiments. Then, one sweltering afternoon, August demanded to be taken outside. Two strong men lifted his frail body onto a litter, and Isabel walked beside them, her steps slow, her dread palpable. Amara followed at a distance, clutching her shawl against the humid air, her stomach tight with unease. The procession wound its way beyond the manicured gardens, past the last rows of cane, to the swampy edge of the property, a place where sunlight died beneath the heavy moss of cypress trees. There, in a small, isolated cabin, another figure waited Kofi, a powerful field hand with arms like iron and eyes that burned with wary defiance. He stood silent as August was set down before him, the feverish master struggling to sit upright. Isabel's hands trembled at her sides. She already knew this journey was not for medicine or air. It was for something far darker. An experiment, August said hoarsely, motioning weakly between Kofi and Amara. Strength and resilience combined, perfected. I wish to see the child you will produce. The words froze the air itself. Isabel's face drained of color. Amara's heart pounded like thunder in her chest. For a moment, even the insects fell silent. Kofi stepped forward, his deep voice steady but thick with anger. I am a man, he said slowly, not an animal for your games. August's expression twisted. Philosopher vanished and the tyrant returned. Remind him of his station. He hissed, his guards obeyed. The sound of fists striking flesh echoed through the cabin, mingling with Isabel's muffled sobs. August watched without flinching, his eyes gleaming with godlike conviction. When it was done, he turned to his wife. You will oversee the project, he ordered, voice void of emotion. Record everything. In that moment, Isabel's silence became complicity, and Amara's quiet defiance hardened into something else, the first seed of a fury that would one day consume them all. The Louisiana heat hung thick over Belle Plantation, but it was the storm that finally broke the air. Roaring across the bayou as if nature itself had grown furious at what had taken root on that cursed land. The thunder rolled over the cane fields, lightning slashing the sky in violent bursts that illuminated the decaying manor and the dying man within it. Auguste Deveau lay on his deathbed, his breath shallow, his mind clinging stubbornly to the monstrous legacy he had crafted. The fire that had once burned with visionary brilliance now flickered dimly behind eyes sunken deep into his skull. Yet even in his final moments, he spoke not of redemption or God, but of blood and progress. Isabel sat beside him, her pale hands trembling as they rested in his skeletal grip. She had waited for this moment for years, the release that would come with his passing, but now that it was here, it brought no peace, only a hollow dread that settled deep in her chest. Their sons, Laurent and Jean, Luc, stood by the door, two small figures barely understanding the weight of the moment. Laurent's gentle heart ached with pity for his father, while Jean, Luc's young eyes burned with resentment at the pain etched on his mother's face. The storm outside raged like divine punishment, lightning spilling through the cracks in the heavy drapes as Auguste rasped for his wife to come closer. His voice was little more than a whisper, yet it carried the authority of a dying tyrant. "Swear it," he said, his bony fingers clutching her wrist with surprising strength. "Swear you will not let our legacy die with me. The future of Belle Reve lies not in the land, but in the blood. Do not fail me, Isabel." He pressed a heavy leather, bound journal into her hand, its pages filled with the scrawls of his madness. Notes, diagrams, and the careful arithmetic of cruelty. The book felt alive, pulsing with the weight of generations yet unborn. Isabel's tears fell silently onto its cracked cover as she whispered the words he demanded, her voice shaking with a grief that was not for him, but for herself. "I swear it," she breathed, and in that vow, The last flicker of triumph crossed his face before he exhaled one final rattling breath and was gone. The wind howled through the manor as though to mourn, or to celebrate, his departure. Isabel's cry cut through the storm, raw and human, a release of years of fear and submission. But beneath the grief was something else, something colder, the tightening of resolve. By the time dawn came, Belle Reve had a new master. The days that followed were marked by transformation. The decay that had crept into every corner of the plantation began to vanish under Isabel's relentless order. The tarnished silver was polished to gleaming brightness, the gardens restored, the curtains drawn wide to let in the sun. The office that had once been August's domain of cluttered genius was scrubbed of all trace of him. His scattered books on animal breeding and pseudoscience were burned, replaced by neat ledgers and polished pens. The smell of whiskey and dust gave way to lemon oil and the faint sweetness of beeswax. It was as though she had purged the man from the walls, but kept his vision alive in her own image, clean, efficient, merciless. When she summoned Laurent to her office one afternoon, the boy had grown into a tall but nervous 16-year-old, his features refined but his spirit already shadowed by unease. He entered with the hesitant grace of someone forever bracing for reprimand. Isabel sat behind the great mahogany desk, her posture impeccable, her beauty as cold and flawless as porcelain. On the desk before her lay a new ledger, larger and more imposing than the one she had inherited. "Your father was a visionary," she began, her voice smooth and composed, "but he lacked discipline. I have brought order to his genius." She opened the ledger with the deliberate care of a priest revealing a sacred text. "This book," she continued, "is the key to our prosperity. It is time you understood what sustains this estate." Laurent stepped closer, his curiosity mingling with dread. On the open pages, neat columns of names stretched downward, names he recognized, the people who lived and worked in the quarters. Alongside them were notes in his mother's perfect looping script, measurements of height, weight, strength, intelligence, and something far more disturbing, temperament. It was not a record of labor, it was a record of breeding. He saw Amara's name, and beneath it, an entry about her child, Elias, strong but defiant, marked with a note of disapproval. Laurent's heart clenched as he looked up from the page, his face pale. "Mother," he stammered, "this isn't right. They're people." Isabel's gaze snapped up, and the warmth drained from the room. "They are assets, Laurent," she said with quiet venom, "and you are the heir to this estate. You must learn to see the world as it is, not as you wish it to be." Her words struck him harder than any slap. He saw in her face the reflection of the man who had died in that storm, and in that moment he understood the cruel inheritance that awaited him. As she closed the ledger with a soft thud, the sound seemed to echo through his chest. "You will learn this book," she said, her tone final. "It is your duty." Laurent left the office in silence, the air outside thick with humidity and the cries of cicadas, but he felt nothing but cold. The plantation that had once seemed vast and alive now felt like a machine, each person a cog in its unholy design. He could feel the roots of something dark wrapping around his heart, whispering that the sins of the father had not died with him. They had only changed hands. Down in the quarters, the whispers began again. The new mistress was not like the old master. August's cruelty had been fiery, impulsive, the madness of a storm. Isabel's was something worse, precise, methodical, impossible to escape. The pairings, as they were called, had not stopped. They had multiplied. And somewhere in the silence of those long humid nights, Amara began to feel the stirring of something that was not fear, but the first faint pulse of vengeance. Night fell heavy over Belle Reve, the kind of thick southern darkness that seemed to swallow the stars. In the cramped quarters at the edge of the fields, a low murmur filled the air, the sound of fear being shared in whispers too soft for the overseers to hear. The men and women gathered around the dim glow of a tallow candle, its trembling light carving their faces out of the blackness. They spoke of Isabelle Deveau, the new mistress of the plantation, and how her cruelty was unlike her husband's. Auguste had been cruel out of passion, striking like lightning in sudden bursts of madness. But Isabelle's cruelty was different, colder. It was the cruelty of a scalpel, clean, deliberate, precise. The pairings had continued after Auguste's death, only now they followed an order that was almost scientific. Men and women were called to the big house, their fates decided by the turn of a page in Isabelle's black ledger. It was no longer an experiment, no longer hidden behind the illusion of philosophy. It was policy. It was law. Amara sat in the corner of Mamadi's cabin, the soft creak of the old woman's rocking chair marking the rhythm of the conversation. In her lap lay her young son, Elias, his head resting against her chest. He was a beautiful child, the image of strength in his small frame, his eyes bright and watchful like his mother's. He was the only good thing born of horror, and Amara clung to him as though he were proof that something pure could still survive in the poisoned soil of Bel Rev. Kofi paced the floor like a caged panther, the shadows stretching long over his powerful frame. His body still bore the scars of Auguste's brutal lesson from years before, but his spirit burned hotter than ever. "She is poisoning us," he said, his voice low but trembling with fury, from the inside out. "She breeds the spirit out of us. She wants children who don't know they can fight. We cannot let our sons be born into this." His eyes flicked toward Elias, and the boy stirred slightly, the movement small but piercing. Mamadi, her eyes half hidden beneath the folds of her age, stopped rocking. The candlelight caught the deep lines etched into her face, a map of sorrow, survival, and silent rebellion. "A snake is most dangerous when you corner its son," she said softly. "Her power is in that house, in that book. Rage burns fast and dies fast, but memory is a river, it cuts through stone." Her words fell into the silence like stones themselves, rippling through the small group. "We watch, we wait, we remember every name, every sin. The river is rising." Outside, the night hummed with the sounds of insects and the rustling of cane leaves. The air was thick with the smell of sugar and sweat, but beneath it was something else, the faint electric scent of change. Amara's eyes met Mamadi's, and in that silent exchange, understanding passed between them. Patience was not surrender, it was strategy, but deep in her chest, something fierce had begun to move. The seed of rage Auguste had planted years ago was beginning to grow roots. As months slipped into years, the seasons turned over the land like pages in a grim book. The summers blazed, the winters steamed, and Bel Rev continued its rhythm of labor and silence. Isabelle's rule was absolute. She ruled not with whips or shouts, but with the quiet terror of inevitability. She never raised her voice, never dirtied her hands, and yet her word fell heavier than any lash. Every decision, every birth, every death, all were recorded neatly in her ledger, the ink of domination written in graceful loops of perfect handwriting. Laurent, now 19, had grown into a tall, handsome young man with his father's features but none of his fire. The nervousness that had marked his childhood had hardened into something more permanent, a quiet tremor in his hands, a haunted look in his eyes. The weight of his mother's will pressed down on him every hour of every day, shaping him into the image she demanded. He walked with the stiffness of a man always expecting judgment. One humid afternoon, a message summoned him to the old cabin by the swamp, the same place where his father had once committed his greatest sin. The path there was halves, wallowed by weeds now, the air thick with the hum of insects. He stepped inside, and his mother was waiting for him, standing tall in her immaculate dress, as though the muck and decay of the swamp could not touch her. Beside her stood a young enslaved girl, trembling, barely 16. Her eyes were wide and wet, her breath shallow, as though fear itself had taken hold of her lungs. Isabelle's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "The stock has become too insular," she said evenly. Your father understood the importance of diversity in bloodlines, but he lacked refinement. To truly strengthen the line, we must mix superior blood our blood. Her words fell like stones, deliberate, unfeeling. It is time you fulfill your duty to this family. Laurent stared at her, his face draining of all color, as the meaning of her command struck him. He looked at the terrified girl, and saw Amara's face in hers, saw Kofi, saw the generations of suffering behind her eyes. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Mother, no, this is wrong." For a brief moment, the mask of composure slipped from Isabel's face, revealing something cold and reptilian beneath. "A sin," she repeated, her tone mocking. "Your father gave his life for this vision. He built a legacy of perfection, and you would destroy it because you are weak." Her words lashed like a whip. "You are a devout. The bloodline must remain strong. It is not a request. It is your purpose." Laurent's protest collapsed into sobs. "Please," he begged, falling to his knees, "I'll do anything. Manage the fields, the accounts. Just not this." Isabel's reply was calm, almost gentle. "You speak of worth, yet you refuse the task that gives your name value. Do you wish to be master of Bel Rev, or a sentimental fool with no land, no legacy, no future?" She let the words sink in, her eyes never leaving his face. "Your brother is stronger than you think. An heir can always be replaced." Something inside him broke then with an almost audible snap. The last of his resistance drained away, his sobs quieted, replaced by a hollow silence. When he finally looked up at his mother, his eyes were empty. "It is already done," Isabel said softly, as though bestowing a blessing. "You are merely the instrument." And so he became exactly that, an instrument of his mother's monstrous will. When he walked out of that cabin, he was no longer a man. He was a shadow, a ghost moving through the fields of Bel Rev, bound not by chains, but by blood. In the days that followed, the girl vanished. Her absence was never spoken of. The ledger gained a new entry, written in Isabel's perfect, merciless script. And in the quiet of her office, the mistress of Bel Rev smiled faintly, believing her legacy secured. But outside, beneath the same sun that scorched the fields, something unseen was beginning to stir. The river Mamadi had spoken of was no longer waiting. It was beginning to rise. The tension that had long coiled inside Bel Rev finally began to fray, thin as a spider's thread stretched to breaking. The years had carved deep changes into the DeVoe household. Laurent, though still young, had withered into a hollow reflection of the boy he once was. The weight of his mother's sins had bent him, drained the color from his spirit, until he moved through the grand halls like a ghost. Across the table from him sat his younger brother, Jean-Luc, now 17, with fire in his eyes that not even Isabel's cold authority could extinguish. He had grown defiant, his jaw set in a permanent challenge to the world she ruled. The dining room, polished and elegant, glittered under candlelight, but the air was tense, thick with the quiet war being waged between mother and son. The crystal reflected the orange glow of the lamps, catching the faint tremble of Laurent's hand as he tried to eat, his fork clinking against porcelain in a steady, nervous rhythm. Isabel sat at the head of the table, immaculate as ever, her posture perfect, her beauty untouched by time or guilt. When she spoke, her voice was soft, controlled, but it carried through the air like a whip. "Jean-Luc," she said, her tone almost kind, "you have come of age. You have watched your brother fulfill his duties. Now it is time you contribute to our family's legacy." The words landed with quiet precision, each one an arrow aimed straight at his soul. She did not elaborate, she didn't need to. The implication was as clear as the gleam of the silverware. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then Jean-Luc's chair scraped violently against the polished floor as he stood, fury twisting his features. "Never," he shouted, his voice raw and trembling. "Never. I will not be part of this sickness." His hand grabbed the nearest plate and hurled it against the far wall, where it shattered into a spray of porcelain shards. "Look at him," he cried, pointing at Laurent, whose pale face barely lifted from his plate. "Look what you've done to him. He's not even alive anymore. You've turned him into one of your experiments. Laurent flinched, mumbling softly, "Jean, Luke, please, don't." His voice was small, broken, the voice of a man begging for quiet rather than justice. But Jean, Luke was beyond silence. His rage was too big, too old, fed by years of fear and witnessing the slow death of everyone he loved. "Father was mad," he said, turning his burning eyes back to Isabelle. "A madman with delusions of godhood. But you," his voice cracked, heavy with disgust, "you are worse, because you know exactly what you are doing." His words hung in the air like smoke. Isabelle did not move. She did not flinch. Her eyes remained fixed on him, unblinking, her lips pressed into a faint, knowing smile. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and deliberate, each word carefully placed. "Your compassion is a liability, Jean. Luke, a weakness I will cure." She paused, her expression unreadable. "I know about the girl, Sarah." The name struck him like a physical blow. He froze. Isabelle's tone sharpened, though it never rose above civility. "You spend time in the quarters. You share your books, your words, your thoughts. She reads well, doesn't she? Strong, bright, a fine specimen." Her eyes gleamed with cold amusement. "Perhaps she will be the one to teach you obedience." Jean, Luke's stomach turned to ice. "Don't you dare," he whispered. Isabelle leaned slightly forward, her gaze piercing through him. "Defiance will be the price of her ruin. Compliance, the price of her safety. You decide which you can live with." The silence that followed was unbearable. The only sound was the faint tapping of rain beginning to fall against the window panes, as if the heavens themselves had begun to weep for him. Jean, Luke's breath came fast and uneven. His anger melted into horror, his fists shaking at his sides. He had never felt more powerless. Isabelle had found his heart, and she was going to use it as a weapon against him. She stood gracefully, her chair sliding back without a sound. "You will learn," she said softly, smoothing the folds of her gown. "One way or another." With that, she turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the long marble corridor until the sound vanished completely, leaving the brothers alone in the suffocating quiet. Laurent finally looked up, his face pale and drawn. "Do what she says," he whispered hoarsely. "Don't make her angry. You don't know what she'll do." "Jean," Luke looked at him, really looked, and saw not a brother, but a broken reflection of what he himself could become. His anger simmered beneath the surface, replaced by a cold, bitter clarity. He realized that the war he had just declared was not one he could win by defiance alone. His mother's power was too vast, her cruelty too measured. But even so, he swore silently that he would not let her break another life to feed her delusion. Far from the glittering horror of the dining room, the small town of St. Martinville basked under the lazy sun of late afternoon. It was a place where gossip carried faster than news, where the air smelled of tobacco and the slow churn of the river. Into this sleepy, suspicious world rode Dr. Alistair Finch, a man of science from Boston, whose boots and spectacles marked him as a stranger from the moment he stepped off his carriage. He had come south to study fevers and diseases of the bayou, drawn by reports of mysterious ailments that plagued the region. But one evening, as he sat in the dim light of the local saloon, he heard a name whispered between two men, Belrev. They spoke of it the way one might speak of a haunted place, their voices low, their eyes darting toward the door. They said the plantation was cursed, its mistress a woman colder than death, and the children born there were strange, weak, malformed, touched by something unnatural. One of the men made the sign of the cross and muttered, "The devil collects his due from that bloodline." Dr. Finch had no patience for superstition, but as a man of reason, he could not ignore the pattern beneath the tale. Children born sick, malformed, dying young, these were not curses. These were symptoms. He listened carefully, his mind working through the facts. A closed population, isolated, generations bound to the same soil, it sounded less like folklore and more like a medical phenomenon. Inbreeding, perhaps, or the long-term effects of hereditary disease. Whatever it was something he could study, diagnose, and expose. When he left the saloon, the decision was already made. The rumors of Belrev had become a question that demanded an answer. Under the guise of research, he would visit the plantation and see the truth for himself. As his carriage rolled toward the horizon, the setting sun bled red across the sky, painting the world in shades of warning. The swamp seemed to hold its breath, as if even the trees knew that what waited at Belrev was not an illness of the body, but a sickness of the soul. The carriage rolled slowly along the narrow dirt road, wheels sinking into the soft Louisiana mud as the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of rot and stagnant water. Dr. Alistair Finch sat upright inside, his sharp eyes scanning the landscape beyond the open window. The swamp around him was alive, tangled vines, croaking frogs, and the distant rustle of unseen creatures in the reeds. But as he approached the boundaries of Belrev Plantation, something in the air changed. The wildness of the bayou gave way to an unnerving order. The trees stood back in neat, unnatural rows, the chaos of the swamp replaced by symmetry. The endless green of sugarcane stretched out before him, so meticulously arranged that it looked less like farming and more like a design, as though human hands had forced the land to obey. The closer he came, the quieter the world became. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. When Belrev finally appeared through the veil of mist and cypress, it gleamed in the afternoon sun, a pristine white mansion rising out of the swamp like a ghost of marble and bone. Its towering columns and spotless windows reflected the light with such sharpness that Finch had to squint. It was beautiful, but in the way of a mausoleum. The symmetry was too exact, the stillness too deep. He had expected grandeur, perhaps even decay, but what he found was sterility, an almost surgical cleanliness that felt wrong amid the thick, living pulse of the bayou. As his carriage halted before the steps, a servant appeared, silent as shadow, his eyes fixed to the ground. The man's movements were smooth, mechanical, his face expressionless. Without a word, he opened the door and gestured for the doctor to enter. Finch hesitated only a moment before stepping down, his polished boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He followed the servant up the marble steps and through the double doors, and as they shut behind him, the sounds of the swamp vanished completely. Inside, the air was cool and dry, scrubbed clean of life. The parlor was immaculate, every chair aligned perfectly, every piece of silver gleaming as if freshly polished. The scent of lemon oil lingered faintly, sharp and sterile. Finch's eyes caught on the portraits lining the walls, generations of devots staring down in silence, their expressions proud, their gazes cold. It was not a home, it was a temple to control. He was still absorbing the room's unnatural precision when she appeared. Isabelle DeVoe glided into the parlor like a wraith in silk, her gown a shade of gray that shimmered faintly in the filtered light. Her beauty was undeniable but devoid of warmth, all angles and composure. A mask of civility stretched over something hard and impenetrable. "Dr. Finch," she said, her voice low and perfectly measured, the accent of Louisiana high society softened by careful restraint. "We are honored by your visit, though I confess I do not quite see the purpose of it." She extended a graceful hand, her touch cool, her smile polite but lifeless. Finch inclined his head slightly. "Your plantation is known for its efficiency," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "My research concerns the fevers and ailments common to the region. I wish to understand how such conditions might be prevented. Your estate, I am told, maintains excellent health among its workers. I am eager to learn your methods." For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes, pride, perhaps, or suspicion. "My late husband," she began, "was a man of science in his own right. He believed that progress required understanding and improvement. We continue to follow his principles, which have served us well." She smiled faintly, but it did not reach her eyes. "Our stock is strong." The word hung in the air like a blade. Finch felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Stock," he repeated carefully. "You refer to your workers, madame." Isabelle's lips curved slightly, a gesture that might have been amusement. "The principles are the same, are they not? Whether in animals or men's strength must be cultivated. weakness culled. Before he could respond, a quiet rustle drew his attention. From the edge of the room, a young man entered, tall, pale, and trembling slightly as though afraid of his own movements. Isabel turned toward him. "My son, Laurent," she said. "He assists in the management of the estate." Finch nodded politely, but as Laurent moved closer, he noticed the boy's trembling hands and hollow eyes, the nervous tick in his jaw. The young man avoided both his mother's gaze and the doctor's, focusing instead on the teacup he carried with both hands, as though it were the only solid thing in the room. The silence stretched as Isabel poured tea, each motion so deliberate that it bordered on ritual. Finch lifted his cup, pretending to sip, his attention flicking toward the doorway. Behind the heavy curtains, something moved, a small figure, perhaps a child. He caught only a glimpse, a thin boy of 7 or 8, his face oddly shaped, his eyes wide and too far apart. When the boy shifted, Finch noticed a limp, the uneven rise and fall of his shoulders. Before he could look closer, a servant appeared out of nowhere and hissed at the child in a panic, ushering him away. The curtain fell back into place, but the image burned in Finch's mind like a photograph. The boy's deformity was not random, it was patterned. The pieces of rumor began to connect. He turned his gaze back to Isabel, who was speaking again, her tone smooth and distant. "A strong line ensures a strong estate, doctor. One must be vigilant in such matters." She looked past him, her attention briefly flicking to Laurent, who sat motionless, the teacup trembling between his fingers. "Do you agree?" she asked. Finch forced a thin smile. "Vigilance is indeed vital," he said, his voice calm though his pulse had quickened. In that moment, he understood that he was not speaking to a woman of eccentric beliefs, but to the architect of something monstrous. The conversation ended soon after, polite words exchanged, promises of further discussion made. But as Finch stepped back into the open air, he could not shake the feeling that the plantation was watching him. The house stood silent behind him, its windows gleaming like eyes. Somewhere deep within, he could almost sense the heartbeat of the machine, the precise, relentless rhythm of cruelty disguised as order. What had begun as scientific curiosity was now something else entirely. He was not studying a disease of the body. He had found a disease of the mind, and its name was Belle Rev. Doctor. Alistair Finch spent that night in one of Belle Rev's guest chambers, a high, ceilinged room that seemed untouched by time, its white walls gleaming in the candlelight, its silence deep enough to smother thought. The air inside felt too clean, too perfectly still, and beneath the faint perfume of lavender hung the ghostly scent of something sterile, alcohol, perhaps, or formalin. He sat by the desk long after midnight, his journal open before him, the tip of his pen hovering over the page as he struggled to put into words the unease that had taken root in his mind. The plantation was immaculate, efficient, and utterly unnatural. Every servant moved with mechanical precision, every voice spoke only when spoken to, and every smile looked rehearsed. There was no laughter here, no conversation, not even the casual rhythm of daily life. It was a place that breathed only because its mistress demanded it. He had seen many estates in the South, but none like this, none so perfectly maintained and yet so devoid of humanity. He wrote down his observations methodically, as was his habit: workforce healthy, no evidence of fever or infection, nutrition appears adequate, but behavior uniformly submissive, suggesting either fear or conditioning. He paused, tapping the pen against his chin, then added, possible history of selective breeding. The thought made his stomach tighten, for it recalled Isabel's chilling words: strength cultivated, weakness culled, and the glimpse of that malformed child behind the curtain. The rumors whispered in St. Martinville were no superstition. Something here was deeply, scientifically wrong. He rose and crossed to the window. Outside, the moon hung low over the cane fields, turning them into a sea of silver blades swaying in slow, mournful rhythm. Beyond them, the swamp pulsed with unseen life, frogs croaking, crickets humming. But here, within the manicured borders of Belle Rev, the world was silent. He saw figures moving faintly near the slave quarters, their shadows flickering against the faint lamplight. A soft cry drifted through the still night, quickly silenced. Finch felt his heart beat faster. He had come to study disease, but now he understood. Belrev itself was the infection. Unable to sleep, he took his lantern and crept into the hall. The corridor stretched long and dim, portraits watching him with unblinking eyes. As he passed the grand staircase, he noticed the faintest glimmer of light leaking from a door at the end of the west wing, a narrow door half hidden behind an ornate tapestry. The rational part of his mind told him to turn back, to wait for morning and ask his questions properly. But curiosity, the same force that had driven him across the country, overcame caution. He approached the door quietly, every board beneath his boots creaking like a warning. The door was not locked. He eased it open, the hinges groaning softly, and descended the narrow stairs beyond. The air grew colder, damp with the smell of earth and iron. At the bottom, the lantern's glow revealed a low, ceiling chamber lined with shelves of glass jars and books. The air was thick with chemical vapors. He lifted the lantern higher and froze. On the central table lay a collection of specimen jars, each containing something that made his blood run cold. Preserved fetuses, malformed and twisted, suspended in amber liquid. Some bore human features unmistakably, others seemed something in between, their proportions wrong, their limbs uneven. Beneath each jar, a label in elegant script recorded its lineage and traits. It was not a laboratory of healing. It was a vault of monstrosity. His gaze fell upon an open journal beside the jars, the same precise handwriting he had seen earlier. He flipped through the pages, and his horror deepened. The entries spoke clinically of pairings, of control groups, of outcomes measured in strength, intelligence, docility. Each failure was recorded with calm detachment, each life reduced to data. The sound of footsteps startled him. He turned sharply, closing the journal, and for an instant the lantern light caught the pale oval of a face at the top of the stairs. Laurent stood there, trembling, his hand gripping the banister as though to steady himself. His eyes were hollow, reflecting both guilt and terror. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. Finch lowered his voice. "You know what's being done here, don't you?" Laurent swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "I know," he said, his voice breaking, "but there's no stopping her. She keeps records of everything, every name, every birth. If anyone disobeys, they disappear. She calls it progress." His trembling hands clutched at his chest as if the weight of his own complicity was crushing him. "I tried to burn her ledgers once," he confessed, "but she has copies hidden everywhere. It's not a plantation anymore, it's a breeding ground, and we're all trapped inside it." Finch stepped closer, his voice urgent but controlled. "Then help me expose her. What she's doing is a crime against God and man." Laurent's eyes darted toward the stairs, his voice trembling into a whisper. "If she finds out I spoke to you, she'll have me buried next to the others." Before Finch could press him further, a soft creak echoed from above, the unmistakable sound of another door opening. Laurent stiffened. "Go," he hissed. "Forget what you saw. Leave before morning." He extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness, and fled up the stairs. Finch stumbled back to his room in the pitch black, his pulse hammering in his ears. He lay awake until dawn, the images of the jars burning behind his eyelids. By the time sunlight seeped through the curtains, his mind was made up. He would gather proof, escape this place, and bring its horrors to light. But when he dressed and went downstairs, the house was different. The servants avoided his eyes. Isabelle was waiting for him in the parlor, her posture as serene as ever, though her expression carried a faint trace of amusement. "You were exploring last night," she said, as though commenting on the weather. Finch froze. She gestured gracefully to the tea set on the table. Curiosity is an admirable trait in a man of science, but dangerous in a guest. Her voice was soft, almost tender, but beneath it pulsed a quiet threat. "You see, Doctor, our family values discretion above all. We prefer that visitors leave with fond memories, not questions." He tried to speak, to feign ignorance, but she silenced him with a raised hand. I know what you think you found, she continued, her gaze sharpening, but you misunderstand. What you call cruelty, I call refinement. Nature is flawed, doctor. God makes mistakes. I correct them. Her smile was faint and cold. Would you not do the same if you could? Finch met her eyes and saw nothing human there, only a calm, unshakable conviction. He realized then that madness, when paired with intelligence and power, became something invincible. He bowed stiffly, muttered something polite, and withdrew, his mind racing. As he crossed the veranda toward the carriage waiting at the gate, he felt the weight of invisible eyes on his back. The servants did not wave. The fields stood still, and though he was leaving Belle Reve behind, he knew that the sickness he had seen there was not contained by its walls. It lived in the blood, in the soil, in the calm smile of the woman who ruled it, and in the silence of those too broken to resist. The rain came heavy that night, sweeping across the cane fields in long silver sheets that rattled against the windows of Belle Reve and turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Thunder cracked over the swamp, shaking the house with a deep, almost human groan, as if the earth itself had grown tired of carrying the sins buried beneath it. Dr. Finch's carriage had long since vanished down the winding road toward St. Martinville, but his absence left behind more than silence. It left a tremor, faint but spreading. The servants spoke of it in whispers, of how the northern doctor had entered the mistress's forbidden wing and left pale as a ghost. Isabelle DeVoe herself remained serene, her every movement as deliberate as ever. But those who knew her face well could sense something different. A tension beneath the calm, a flicker of unease behind the smooth perfection of her smile. She had built Belle Reve upon the illusion of control, and control, she knew, was a delicate thing. One rumor, one frightened whisper, could unravel the design she had spent years perfecting. So she moved swiftly and silently, tightening her grip on everything and everyone. The ledgers were locked away in new hiding places, the quarters watched by new overseers, and those suspected of gossiping were quietly sent away under the cover of darkness, their names erased from record. By morning, the plantation had returned to its perfect stillness, but the air was thick with the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Laurent moved through those days like a ghost caught between two worlds, the one his mother demanded he maintain, and the one his conscience no longer allowed him to endure. The image of the jars in the cellar haunted him. He had long known what his mother did, had even helped record the results in her ledgers, but seeing them through Finch, his horrified eyes had changed something in him. He no longer saw data or duty, he saw lives mutilated in the name of purity. Every time he passed the fields, every time he saw Amara's son Elias carrying water or bending over the cane, the guilt clawed at his throat. Elias was no longer a child. He was 16 now, tall and strong, with his mother's fierce eyes and his father's quiet fire. There was something in his presence that unsettled the white overseers, something that made them step back without realizing why. He worked hard, never complained, but his silence carried a weight, and the others followed his lead. Rumors began to spread, not of fear this time, but of hope. They said Elias could stare down a man twice his size and make him drop his whip. They said his voice, when he spoke, could quiet a crowd. Some even said that Amara's blood carried something sacred, something the DeVoes had tried to control and failed. Isabelle noticed it too. One afternoon, she watched from her balcony as Elias crossed the fields, the sun blazing on his skin, his movements fluid and sure. Her eyes narrowed, her gloved hands tightening around the railing. Too proud, she murmured, too aware of himself. To her, pride was the seed of rebellion, the same disease that had infected her husband and nearly destroyed her sons. Pride had to be excised, not punished but corrected. That evening, she called Laurent into her study. The rain had not yet started, but thunder rolled low in the distance. "You've seen him," she said without preamble, her voice cool and measured. "Amara's boy. He's different, dangerous." Laurent hesitated. "He works hard, mother. He's done nothing wrong." Isabelle's expression hardened. Wrong? His very existence is a challenge to order. His blood is impure, yet he carries himself as if he were born of this house. He must be taught what he is. Laurent's stomach turned. He knew what those words meant. There was always a lesson in Belrev, and it was always cruel. Please, he said quietly, don't harm him. Isabelle's gaze pierced through him. You forget your place, my son. Weakness has destroyed this family once before. I will not allow it to happen again. Her tone softened slightly, almost tender. You can still redeem yourself. Take charge of this matter. Make him understand where he belongs. Laurent nodded slowly, the motion mechanical, though his heart pounded with dread. That night, as lightning split the sky and rain battered the earth, Laurent made his way to the quarters. The fields were deserted, the wind carrying the scent of wet cane and smoke. In the shadows he found Elias repairing the door of a storage shed, his sleeves rolled up, his muscles taut in the flickering light. Elias, Laurent called softly. The boy turned, wary but not afraid. Master Laurent, his voice was steady, you should be inside, storm's coming. Laurent stepped closer, rain plastering his hair to his face. My mother has noticed you, he said. That's not a good thing. Elias's eyes narrowed. I don't seek her notice. You don't have to, Laurent replied. It finds everyone eventually. He hesitated, his words trembling. You have to leave tonight. Take your mother, take anyone you can, and go north. There's a settlement near Baton Rouge where you might find refuge. Elias studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Why are you telling me this? Laurent's voice cracked. Because she means to destroy you. You remind her of everything she can't control. Elias looked past him toward the house, the great white columns faintly glowing against the storm. If she means to destroy me, he said quietly, then let her try. The wind rose, scattering leaves and dust, and in that instant Laurent saw something in Elias's face that terrified and awed him at once. A calm defiance, the same look he had once seen in Kofi before the guards beat him near to death. Don't be a fool, Laurent urged, his voice desperate now. She has power more than you understand. Elias turned back toward the fields, rain running down his face like tears. Then it's time someone took it from her. He shouldered his tools and walked into the darkness, leaving Laurent standing in the rain, trembling not from cold but from the knowledge that something irreversible had just begun. By morning the storm had passed, but the air felt charged, the plantation too quiet. The overseers searched the quarters, claiming to be checking for damage, but in truth they were looking for whispers, for signs of unrest. Amara moved through them silently, her eyes calm but alert. She knew something had shifted. She could feel it in the way the workers looked at her son, in the hushed greetings that passed between them. The time for patience was ending. For years she had waited, endured, survived. But the river Mamadi had spoken of so long ago was swelling now, gathering its strength. And in the big house, Isabelle DeVoe felt it too, though she did not yet understand what it was. She only knew that control, once cracked, could never be perfectly restored. She poured herself a glass of wine and stared out over the shining fields, unaware that the world she had built so carefully was already beginning to crumble beneath her feet, grain by grain, whisper by whisper, heartbeat by heartbeat. The days that followed the storm carried an uneasy calm, silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful. The air itself seemed to hum with something hidden, as if the land were holding its breath. The fields glistened under the sun, the cane standing tall and green, but beneath that surface of order and prosperity, cracks had begun to spread. Whispers passed through the quarters like wind, through grass, whispers of freedom, of defiance, of reckoning. And at the heart of it all stood Elias, the boy who had once been a symbol of his mother's suffering and his master's cruelty, now a man shaped by both. His quiet strength had become something the people clung to, something that filled the spaces where hope had long been absent. He did not speak of rebellion, not openly, but his very presence was rebellion enough. When he walked through the fields, the others straightened. When he spoke, even softly, they listened. Amara watched him with both pride and dread. She knew the fire that burned in him, she had carried it once herself. It was the same fire that had nearly destroyed her, but it was also the only thing that could destroy the curse of Belle Reve. In the mansion, Isabelle DeVoe felt the shift like a change in the weather. Her instincts, sharpened by years of power and paranoia, sensed the faint tremor of disobedience spreading through her perfect machine. The ledgers still balanced, the fields still yielded, but the rhythm of control had faltered. A tool left unattended, a door left ajar, a servant who hesitated before answering small things, but she noticed them all. Order was slipping, and order was the only thing that kept her empire intact. She summoned Laurent to her study, the same room where she had dictated her will for years, surrounded by shelves of books and records that testified to her mastery of everything and everyone within her reach. "There's unrest in the quarters," she said without looking up from her writing. "I can feel it." Laurent stood silently, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Find the source," she continued, her pen scratching softly against the paper. "And when you do, remove it." Laurent swallowed hard, and if the source is Elias, her pen stopped mid-stroke. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. "Then you will do what is necessary," she said finally, her voice like ice. That night, Laurent wandered the estate unable to rest. The moonlight cut pale paths across the lawns, silvering the cane fields and glinting off the still water of the pond. He walked until he found himself near the quarters, where faint lamplight flickered through the slats of a cabin door. Inside, he could hear low voices, Amara's and Elias's. He hesitated, then stepped closer, close enough to hear the tremor of emotion in Amara's tone. "You cannot fight her head on," she whispered. "Her power is not just in her guards or her guns. It's in their fear. Break that and she falls." Elias's voice was calm but hard. "Then fear is what we take back." There was a pause, then the sound of movement, footsteps, a chair scraping the floor. Laurent stepped away, retreating into the darkness before they could see him. His chest felt tight, torn between the duty forced upon him and the horror of what it meant. He could no longer pretend ignorance. His mother's empire was rotting from within, and Elias was the storm that would finish it. The following day, the overseers reported finding tools missing from the barns, food disappearing from the storage sheds, whispers in the cane fields. Isabelle's orders grew more ruthless. "Search everything," she commanded. "No one leaves the property, no one speaks after dark." The plantation became a cage, every door locked, every face watched. The weight of her fear pressed down on everyone, but in trying to tighten her grip, she only fed the rebellion she feared. Elias moved quietly through the chaos, speaking to small groups at night. His words measured and steady. He told them they were more than property, more than bloodlines written in ledgers. "The book doesn't own you," he said softly. "It only tells them what they're afraid of losing." His words spread like wildfire. By the third night, the balance had tipped. A guard vanished during patrol. The next morning, the cane fields were found burning on the western edge, flames devouring the tall green stalks, smoke rising into the dawn like a dark flag. Isabelle stood on the balcony watching the fire spread, her face unreadable. "Find them," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling beneath the folds of her gown. Laurent stood behind her, pale and silent. He knew this was no mere outburst, it was the beginning of something unstoppable. That evening, he went to the cellar beneath the mansion, where his mother's ledgers were kept. The room smelled of mold and old paper. He lit a lamp and stared at the rows of books, years of cruelty bound in leather and ink. He picked one up, opened it, and saw his own handwriting beside his mother's. Notes, numbers, lives catalogued like animals. His stomach turned. He could destroy them all, he thought, burn them. But even as he imagined the flames, he knew it was too late. The fire outside had already begun, and no amount of paper could save or erase what had been done. That night, the rebellion came to Belle Reve. It began with silence, the kind that falls before a storm. Then came the footsteps, the whisper of movement through the darkened halls. The first scream shattered the quiet like glass. Isabelle woke to the sound of chaos. shouts, the crack of gunfire, the crash of glass. From her window, she saw torches moving through the fields, a river of light surging toward the house. Her perfect world, her creation, was dissolving in fire. She dressed quickly, her hands trembling only once as she fastened the clasp of her pearls. When Lauren burst into her room, breathless, she was already prepared, her eyes bright with something fierce and terrible. "We will not flee," she said. "This is our home." "It's over," Lauren said desperately. "Please, Mother, we have to leave." But she only smiled a thin, lifeless smile. "They won't destroy me," she whispered. "I am Belle Rev." Down in the yard, Elias led the march, his torch high, the flames painting his face with light and shadow. Behind him, men and women moved with grim purpose, not shouting, not wild, but silent, united. The night pulsed with heat and smoke. When they reached the steps, Elias stopped. "Bring her out," someone whispered, but he shook his head. "No," he said quietly, "she'll come." And she did. Isabel stepped out onto the balcony, her gown gleaming white against the smoke, black sky, her face pale and calm. For a moment everything was still, two worlds, two bloodlines, two centuries staring at each other across the divide of history. The fire roared, but no one moved. And in that terrible stillness, something broke, not in the walls, not in the land, but in the air itself, as though the curse of Belle Rev had finally begun to lift its head to face judgment. The firelight painted Belle Rev in colors it had never known: gold, red, and black, the hues of ruin and rebirth. The great mansion that had stood for generations, pristine and untouchable, now looked alive in a way it never had before. Smoke poured through its open windows, curling into the night sky like the souls of the forgotten. Isabel stood motionless on the balcony, her pale face illuminated by the flickering flames below. The heat licked at her gown, the air thick with the scent of burning cane and gunpowder, yet her expression remained composed, almost regal. Below her, Elias and the others stood in grim silence, torches in hand, their eyes fixed on the woman who had ruled them with quiet terror. It was not rage that held them there, but something heavier, older, the weight of centuries pressing down upon one final reckoning. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Isabel's voice, calm and sharp as glass, cut through the crackle of fire. "Do you think this ends with me?" she called out, her tone both defiant and eerily serene. "You can burn my house, my fields, my name, but you cannot burn blood. You carry it in you. You carry me." Her words rippled through the crowd like a curse, stirring unease even in the bravest hearts. But Elias did not flinch. He stepped forward, his torch lowered, his voice steady. "We carry nothing of you," he said. "We were never yours to own." His words were quiet, but they carried farther than her shouts ever could. Behind him, the flames climbed higher, devouring the cane fields that had fed her empire. The overseers had fled hours earlier, the guards had thrown down their weapons or joined the people they once beat. Isabel's dominion was crumbling, but she refused to see it. She turned to Lauren, who stood behind her, pale and shaking, his eyes wide with horror. "This is your doing," she hissed. "You brought them here. You let them rise." Lauren's voice broke when he spoke. "No, Mother," he said, his words trembling. "You did. You made all of this." Isabel's eyes burned, her control fracturing for the first time. "I made this world," she whispered, her voice rising with the wind. "I gave it order. I gave it purpose." But Lauren only shook his head. "You gave it nothing but pain." For a heartbeat, something flickered across her face: doubt, fear, the ghost of humanity, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She straightened, her composure snapping back into place like armor. "If I cannot rule it," she said coldly, "then I will destroy it." Without warning, she turned and disappeared into the house, her gown sweeping behind her like a ghost's shadow. Lauren hesitated only a second before chasing after her, shouting her name. Inside, the grand hall was already filling with smoke, the fire climbing the drapes, spreading along the banisters. He found her in the study, the room of ledgers and secrets, frantically pulling books from the shelves, her hands blackened with soot. "Help me," she cried, her voice hoarse. "We can still save them." But Laurent saw what she meant: not the people, not the estate, but the ledgers, the records of bloodlines and experiments, her legacy of cruelty. "No," he said, stepping between her and the shelves. "Let them burn." She froze, disbelief twisting into fury. "You ungrateful child," she screamed, striking him across the face. "Do you think you can erase me?" The room shook as a beam above them cracked and fell, showering them in sparks. Laurent stumbled back, his cheek bleeding, but he did not move aside. "You already erased yourself," he said softly. The fire roared through the room, consuming the shelves, the books, the empire she had built from the suffering of others. Isabelle stared at the flames, her face caught between horror and awe. For years she had imagined herself untouchable, a creator above the reach of sin or justice. But now, as the fire surrounded her, she saw the truth that all her control had been an illusion, fragile as paper. The smoke thickened, choking the air. Laurent tried to pull her toward the door, but she wrenched free, her eyes fixed on the burning ledgers. "They're mine," she gasped. "They're all I have." He called her name one last time, but she did not answer. The ceiling groaned, the floor gave way beneath the heat, and with a deafening crash, the study collapsed in on itself. Laurent was thrown back by the force of it, his body hitting the marble floor. For a moment, he lay there, dazed, the world spinning, until strong arms lifted him. Through the haze of smoke, he saw Elias's face streaked with ash, calm and steady. "Come on," Elias said, "it's over." Laurent nodded weakly, allowing himself to be led out through the collapsing hallways as the mansion groaned and cracked around them. Outside, the people stood watching as the great house burned, its flames reflected in their eyes. The rain had started again, slow at first, then heavy, hissing as it struck the fire. The torches went out one by one, their purpose fulfilled. Amara stood at the edge of the crowd, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the balcony where Isabelle had last stood. Her face showed no triumph, no vengeance, only a weary kind of peace. She had waited years for this night, but now that it had come, it felt less like victory and more like release, the closing of a wound too deep to heal. Laurent stumbled beside Elias, coughing, his clothes blackened, his eyes wide with grief. "She's gone," he murmured. Elias looked toward the ruins of the mansion. "So is her curse," he said. The wind carried the smoke away toward the bayou, where it mingled with the mist rising from the water, vanishing into the night. As dawn broke, the rain stopped, and the first light touched the ashes of Belle Reve. The mansion was gone, reduced to smoldering bones of wood and iron, its columns collapsed, its gardens scorched to mud. The fields still smoked, the air thick with the scent of burned sugar. In the silence that followed, the people stood together, not slaves, not property, but free for the first time in memory. No one spoke of revenge. They simply looked toward the horizon, where the land met the river and the future waited, uncertain but their own. Amara took her son's hand and led him toward the edge of the property. Behind them, Laurent followed, limping, his face drawn but determined. He had lost his mother, his home, his history, but perhaps in losing them, he had also found the first fragments of redemption. When they reached the road, Amara turned one last time. Smoke curled up into the pale morning sky, thin and soft, no longer angry, no longer alive. The house that had ruled their lives was gone. All that remained was the land itself, scarred but enduring, waiting for something new to grow. The sun rose slow and pale over the ruins of Belle Reve, its light falling gently on the charred bones of what had once been an empire. Fire was out, but the smoke lingered, curling lazily over the blackened fields like the last breath of a dying world. The mansion was gone, the great white columns that had once stood as symbols of power now lay in heaps of cracked stone, half buried in ash. The air smelled of wet earth and burnt sugar, thick but strangely clean, as if the land itself had been washed of something foul. In the quiet after destruction, time seemed to pause. The birds did not sing, the cane did not rustle, and even the river, winding silently through the bayou, seemed to hold its current still, as if bearing witness to the end of a curse. The people of Bel Rev gathered near what remained of the quarters, their faces lit by the thin light of morning. For the first time in generations, there was no overseer to bark orders, no bell to mark the start of labor. They stood uncertainly, bound not by chains now, but by the strangeness of freedom. Some wept softly, others simply stared at the horizon, as if trying to remember how to dream beyond the borders of the plantation. Amara moved among them, her steps steady, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cool dawn. Her eyes, once shadowed by grief, now held a quiet fire, not the heat of vengeance, but the steady warmth of survival. She found Laurent sitting by the edge of the field, his head bowed, his hands blackened from smoke and ash. He looked up when she approached, his expression hollow. "I tried to save her," he said quietly, "but she wouldn't come." Amara studied him for a moment, then shook her head slowly. She didn't want saving. Some souls choose their own fire. Her voice was neither cruel nor forgiving, only certain. Laurent dropped his gaze again, his lips trembling. "I thought burning it all would end the past," he murmured, "but it's still here in me." Amara knelt beside him, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. Then